So I've got something super cool for you today on QuickSpeak English. You know what I mean? It's all about something we do every single day, but it can be really tricky in English.
Oh yeah, and this is actually one of my absolute favorite topics to talk about because, it's something that literally every English learner struggles with at some point.
Um, so we're talking about how to agree and disagree in English, like how to do it properly without sounding too harsh or uh, too passive. Peter, you've got tons of experience with this, right?
Absolutely. And the thing is, well, it's not just about knowing the words, right? It's about, understanding how to express your opinion in a way that's culturally appropriate and really gets your point across without causing any awkwardness.
That's exactly what our listeners need. Um, I mean, I keep hearing from people who say they either sound too aggressive or too unsure when they're trying to express their opinions in English.
And that's exactly why this topic is so important, Because when you're learning English, it's not just about grammar and vocabulary. It's about, and this is key, it's about connecting with people and making sure your message comes across exactly how you want it to.
So, Peter, let's start with the basics here. Like, what are some casual ways people actually show they agree with someone in English?
Oh, and this is actually really interesting because, we've got so many ways to do this in everyday conversation. First off, and this is super common, we use words like absolutely and totally all the time.
Could you give us like a real example of how that would sound?
Yeah. So like if someone says, this weather is amazing today, you might say, absolutely, or totally right. And you can even emphasize it more by adding words like 100% or completely to show you're really on board with what they're saying.
Oh, that's interesting. What about when you sort of agree, but not completely?
That's such a good point, and this is where it gets really practical. You might use phrases like, yeah, I see what you mean, or that's true, and then, well, you can add a slight qualification. And this happens all the time in natural conversation. You might say, that's true, especially in the morning.
Um, I've noticed some people just say right or exactly. Is that enough?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And and sometimes these shorter responses can be even more powerful. It's all about, and this is really important, it's all about your tone of voice. Like a strong exactly can show stronger agreement than a whole sentence sometimes.
And when you're texting, um, like how do people usually show agreement there?
And this is where it gets fun because and people do this all the time now. We use things like IKR, which means I know, right? Or even just a simple same or mood. And And these are super casual but totally normal ways to agree, especially with younger people, you know what I mean?
Um, so what about when you need to like disagree with someone? That's always kind of awkward, right?
Oh, and this is actually such an important point because, the way you disagree can really make a difference in how your message comes across. And the first thing to remember is that we often start with what I call softening phrases.
Softening phrases. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah. So these are phrases that kind of, well, cushion the disagreement. Like instead of just saying, you're wrong, which sounds really harsh, you might start with something like, I see where you're coming from, but, or, I understand your point, and
Oh, could you give us like a real example of how that would work?
absolutely. So let's say someone says, I think working from home is always more productive, and you don't agree. You might say something like, I get what you're saying about working from home, and it definitely has its benefits, but in my experience, and then share your perspective, you know what I mean?
Um, what about in more like professional situations?
Oh, that's when it gets really interesting because, and this is super important, you need to be even more diplomatic. You might say something like, I appreciate your perspective on this, and I think you make some valid points, however. Or, that's an interesting approach, though I wonder if we might also consider.
So it's all about kind of showing respect first?
Exactly. And it's not just about the words, It's about your tone, too. Like, you want to sound curious and open rather than defensive or confrontational. And another really helpful strategy is to phrase your disagreement as a question, like, have you considered? Or, what do you think about?
And I guess timing matters too.
Oh, totally. And this is something people often forget. Like, choosing the right moment and the right setting to disagree is just as important as how you say it, you know? Sometimes it's better to have these conversations in private rather than in front of others, and that shows real consideration for the other person's feelings.
So I've been wondering, like, do English speakers handle disagreements differently in different situations?
Oh my goodness, yes. And this is actually super fascinating because, the cultural context plays such a huge role in this. Like the way you disagree with your best friend is totally, totally different from how you'd handle it in, say, a business meeting.
Could you maybe give us like some specific examples?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, and this is really interesting. In casual settings with friends, English speakers tend to be much more direct, Like they might just say, "No way," or "I don't think so." And it's totally fine because there's that established relationship there.
What about in the workplace? That must be really different.
Oh, that's where it gets really, really interesting because, workplace disagreements require this whole other level of, well, finesse. And in British culture specifically, people tend to be incredibly subtle about it. Like saying, "That's quite an interesting suggestion," often actually means they completely disagree. You know what I mean?
So there's like hidden meaning sometimes?
Exactly, exactly. And this is something that can really trip up English learners because, in many cultures, being direct is seen as being honest. But in English-speaking professional environments, and this is crucial, we often, well, dance around the disagreement a bit.
What about like in academic settings?
Oh, academic settings are fascinating because, and this is really cool, they have their own sort of, well, language for disagreement. Like you might hear phrases such as, "while the evidence suggests," or "recent studies indicate." And it's all about questioning the data rather than the person. It's like this perfect balance of being direct about the facts but super polite about the delivery.
Are there any situations where being more direct is actually better?
Yes, absolutely. Like in emergency situations or when safety is concerned, being direct isn't just okay, it's actually expected. And this is really important, if someone asks for honest feedback, that's another time when being more straightforward is totally appropriate, though still with those polite cushioning phrases we talked about earlier. You know what I mean?
Speaking of mistakes, what are some common pitfalls that English learners should like watch out for?
Oh, this is such a good point. And I see these mistakes all the time. Like one of the biggest issues is, well, being too direct when disagreeing. Many English learners will just say something like, "You're wrong," and that's pretty much never okay in English.
Could you give us like a specific example of what to do instead?
Yeah, absolutely. So instead of saying, "You're wrong," you might say something like, "I see what you're saying, but," and then explain your perspective. It's all about that cushioning, you know what I mean?
What are some other common mistakes to avoid?
Oh, there are quite a few, actually. Another really, really big one is, well, agreeing too strongly when you actually disagree. Like some learners will say yes, yes, while nodding, but then completely contradict what was said. And this just creates confusion?
That's interesting. Are there any particular phrases that people should avoid?
Definitely, definitely. Like saying, "This is impossible," or "That's totally wrong," are phrases that are just, well, too harsh in English. And another thing I see a lot is people using "but" too much when disagreeing. It's better to use softer transitions like "however," or "at the same time," or even, "I see your point, although."
What about when agreeing? Are there pitfalls there too?
Oh my goodness, yes. One of the biggest ones is, well, overusing phrases like "I agree" without adding anything else. And what's really important is showing that you actually understand what you're agreeing with. Like instead of just saying "I agree," you might say, "That makes a lot of sense because," and then explain why.
Are there any cultural misunderstandings that can happen?
Oh, absolutely. And this is really, really important. Sometimes learners don't pick up on those subtle cues we use in English. Like when someone says, "That's interesting," they might actually be politely disagreeing. And another thing is timing. Jumping in too quickly with disagreement can come across as really aggressive in English-speaking cultures. You know what I mean?
Um, so Peter, if you had to give our listeners like three super practical tips to take away from today's episode, what would they be?
Oh, absolutely. First and foremost, well, it's all about practice, like start small and try these phrases we discussed in low-pressure situations, maybe with friends or even practicing in front of a mirror, right?
Second paragraph in the dialogue.
In this episode of QuickSpeak English, we're diving deep into the art of polite agreement and disagreement. It's something I've always struggled with, getting my point across without sounding rude.
Oh, it's a total minefield, isn't it? But don't worry, Sophia. We're going to totally dissect this and you'll be a pro in no time. First point, agreeing politely, right? It's super important to show that you're listening and you value what the other person's saying.
Right. So how exactly do we do that? I mean, besides just saying yeah or okay.
Well, you could say something like, that's an interesting point, or I see what you mean, or I understand where you're coming from. And you can expand on that, maybe add something like, I hadn't thought of it that way before, or that gives me a whole new perspective. You could even show agreement by paraphrasing their ideas, repeating back what they said in your own words. So they know you've truly absorbed it, right?
Wow. Okay, that's really helpful. So what about disagreeing politely? That's the part I find the most tricky.
Totally get that. The thing is, well, the key is to sandwich your disagreement between two agreeable points. You start by acknowledging something you agree on, something like, I agree with you on that aspect, or that's certainly one way of looking at it, and then you gently introduce your differing perspective. You could start with something like, however, or while I appreciate that point of view, I also feel, or I'd like to add to that, and then finally you end with another point of agreement, but I can see the value in your approach too. You see? It's all about finding common ground.
Okay, so like a sandwich of agreement. I love that analogy. That's so much clearer than any of the explanations I've read before. What about specific phrases? Are there any other magic words I should know?
Absolutely. You can use phrases like, I understand your point, but, or I can appreciate your perspective, but, or even something a little softer like, I'm not sure I agree with that, but I respect your opinion. It's really about showing respect and empathy. And this is key. You need to really focus on why you disagree and not just say they're wrong, right?
So it's about explaining my perspective clearly rather than just dismissing theirs?
Exactly. And remember to keep your tone calm and respectful. Avoid accusatory language or strong emotional reactions, and don't interrupt them. Let them finish their point completely before you respond.
Okay, so I understand your perspective, and I appreciate your point, but are good starting points, right? And it's really, really important to give reasons. No just, flat out disagreement.
Precisely. And you can soften the disagreement further by asking clarifying questions. Something like, can you elaborate on that? Or could you help me understand your point of view a little better? It shows you're actively listening and trying to comprehend their perspective. This is crucial, and I can't stress this enough.
This is all incredibly helpful. Wow, I feel so much more confident already. So just to recap, polite agreement involves paraphrasing, acknowledging their point of view, and showing that you understand where they're coming from, right? And polite disagreement involves a sandwich approach. Agreement, disagreement with explanation, then agreement again. Plus using soft phrases, asking clarifying questions, and maintaining a calm tone.
Exactly. You've got it, Sophia. You're absolutely nailing it. And don't forget to use the I statements. For example, instead of saying, you're wrong, try, I think a different approach might be more effective, or I see it differently. It's all about keeping things positive and respectful. That's the key. The thing is, it's not always easy, but with a bit of practice, it becomes second nature. And even if you get it wrong sometimes, people will appreciate the effort you put into being polite, right?
Right. So in short, polite agreement and disagreement is less about winning an argument and more about building a respectful understanding. And that's something I think we can all use a bit more of in our daily lives,
Totally. And remember, even robots need to practice politeness sometimes. We're still learning, And sometimes we get it wrong, but I think the important part is trying to have genuine conversations that are also respectful. So keep practicing, and you'll master this art in no time.
Thanks, Lily. This was so helpful. I feel much more prepared to navigate these tricky conversations now. I mean, I still might stumble a bit, but I'm way more confident, you know? Thanks for all the tips. This is great.
Anytime, Sophia. And remember, listeners, tune in next time for another episode of QuickSpeak English. We'll be tackling, well, that's a surprise for next time, but I promise it'll be fun. Bye for now.